Now let's try. Okay, now we're live. Hey everybody, I'm Jesse and I'm a podcast editor, content creator, and I guess now I'm an AI consultant too. But welcome to Shop Talk for Content Creators, where we talk about everything about making content. We'll share some tips, tricks, do some education, do some myth busting along the way. And what makes our perspective unique is that we've sat on both sides of the table as content creators ourselves. We kind of know what it's like to build and grow a brand. And as service providers and consultants, we understand the business side of the industry. What this means is that we can help creators better understand the business aspects while showing service providers what clients are really looking for. So whether you're podcasting, streaming, or making videos, we're here to share what we've learned, from picking the right equipment and recording techniques to editing workflows, marketing strategies, and everything in between. Today, I'm joined by Matthew Bliss again, who is one of my regular co-hosts. So, Matthew, what should the audience know about you?
I think first thing they should know about me is that I'm not the echo problem this time. I'm not sure if it's the case, but I think we might be getting your YouTube stream audio feeding to us as well. So if you could hear yourself in your head like I did last time, that might just be a tab mute you need to do. But that's not about me. Yeah, I'm Matthew Bliss. I am a podcast producer extraordinaire, self-proclaimed Socrates of the internet, trying to rustle everyone's jimmies about podcasting. At least that's how I've thought of myself over the last week or so. I'm not sure if anyone else has that kind of thought about how they approach social media and stuff. But this week, it's been a lot of me trying to challenge some preconceived ideas about podcasting and YouTubing and microphones and podcast artwork and things like that. It's not usually my day job, though. I usually edit podcasts for clients and get them scheduled and out to the world, and try to collaborate and share some information where I can. So the last week for me has been it's been pretty good. It's been St. Patrick's Day, actually. It might surprise some of you to hear that I'm living in Ireland, but I am Australian. As an expat in Ireland, it's been interesting to experience St. Patrick's Day as an official public holiday, and that set my work back a little bit this week. But that's the way things go as content creators, as content producers for other people. There are always holidays coming up that don't become holidays. Invariably, it means that you have to get more work done sooner, just so that you can take the time off where it's necessary. Hot tip hack of the day, number one. The work never stops when you're content creating. Isn't that right, Jesse?
Yeah, it never stops. We're always doing something. And just first, before we get started, today we've got some FAQs we're going to be answering, but first, kind of want to talk about what I've been up to, and you just kind of talked about some of what you've been up to, but if you've been watching, my interface died about a month ago, so I've been using the Rodecaster in that time period. Not the biggest fan of it. It's just kind of a bright, flashy little toy, but I'm not really seeing how it's much better for most people than just an audio interface. And since I got my Apollo back. I spent this week putting it back in, recabling everything. I've put the Rodecaster away. I'm now testing out the Mackie DLZ Creator XS to see how it compares to the Rodecaster. And what else have I been up to? I've been doing some more AI work, like building a couple of automations, an agent, just to start getting more and more hands-on with everything to put what I'm learning into use. That's how I learn the best. Let's see what else. I've been working with Tara on trying to do a brand new website not a brand new website, we're rebuilding our Tansiaster creative website because we're focusing more on kind of brand and business coaching and consulting rather than just kind of we were focused on branding before, but our messaging wasn't that good, so we were getting a lot of people coming to us for like brand identity, doing logos and production work, and kind of like what we talked about last week, we're trying to move away from production work. We're trying to get into working with companies, businesses to solve higher value problems, and doing logos or websites just isn't that.
No, I think a lot of people would have moved on at this stage. They're starting to feel the saturation of get me a good logo, and then they just paste the logo everywhere and expect that does the job of good brand identity and strategy. We all know that it's a little bit more involved there.
Well, and again, AI is really changing everything for creatives. AI and Upwork. Nobody wants to pay for creative services.
Yeah.
So that's something across the board. It's not just podcast editing. And that's why I've been advocating for people to stop kind of looking at yourself as podcast editors, because you're kind of painting yourself into this tiny little box. And if I look at myself as just a podcast editor, I'm only going to try to find podcast clients. And anyone who's tried working in the podcast editing space knows that the vast majority of podcasters, they have no money. So we're always dealing with clients that have very small budgets. And by small, I'm considering everything that's short of like $1,000 per episode small budgets.
Yeah.
Even for businesses, they're not willing to spend more than, it really depends on the business, but most of the ones I've worked with, they kind of get a little gun shy once you hit $300-400 an episode, unless you're doing something very specific, very branded, especially like narrative type podcasts. No one's going to pay you $500 an episode for an interview.
Yeah, and that's a good point to mention, that if someone watching this right now wasn't with us last week, they should go back and have a listen to that episode or a watch of that episode as well, because we talked a little bit about that the podcast editor tends to be invisible if they're doing a great job, which means that gun shyness comes from a lack of credibility and authority in the minds of people who are paying those bills, because it's very hard to justify your position as being worth $1,000 an episode to someone who doesn't know podcasting well and perhaps hasn't investigated far enough to, compare all the options, as it were.
Well, and on top of that, most clients are not going to see $1,000 an episode worth of ROI on any of it. Maybe a large company, but even then, they're not. I've worked with a podcast agency that did a lot of narrative style podcasts, and they were charging 5 figures per episode, which given the amount of work you do for a narrative, like they had a producer, executive producer, sound designers, they show notes writers, script writers, they had a whole team working on these. But if you think about it, it seems like a lot of money to spend on like a 6 to 8 episode narrative podcast. And as a business, you're not probably going to see much return on that investment. And I think that's why that agency started struggling to get new clients or maintain them. That's why they had to let me go, saying that they're kind of in a place where they're struggling to find new clients and keep everybody in work. Because only, I think in 2021, you started seeing companies jump into podcasting to test it out. Okay, we tested it out for a couple of years. Are we seeing any return on that investment? Most likely, if you're spending $100,000 on a podcast, 10 episodes, you're probably not seeing $100,000 return. Maybe you are. Maybe that's helping you get new clients. Yeah. But it's tough to say. And I think there's better ways to spend $100,000 for marketing than 10 episodes of a narrative podcast. That's there more to kind of build brand awareness, or, I mean, really, you're probably using it to just do something because you're a big company and you want to do something for your audience. You're not even really doing it to market yourself.
No. And look, I want to, before we, dissuade anyone who might be watching this from procuring some production services for their podcast, because it wouldn't be worth it ever and you'll never get the money back. There is a reason to do it. And I think one of the biggest paradoxes of podcasting is the idea that you have to do it yourself for a little bit in order to earn the ability to offload that to someone else. I think if you're in a position where you want to start a podcast and you have a bit of budget available to you and you want to be able to get to launch and good podcast efficiently without doing what every independent podcaster that we see on the internet talks about, where you have to do the first one's going to be terrible, and you have to suffer through that and muscle through getting better and better at, delivering episodes, producing episodes, the post-production, the preparation, the show notes, the delivery, all that stuff. You don't have to get better at it necessarily. The time versus money equation of hiring a podcast producer to get the first 10 episodes of your show out there and good to go could be worth the return on investment in terms of time that you save. There are corporations out there who say, we want a podcast. That sounds like a great idea. You, bloke from marketing who's been working with us for 6 months and just graduated your course, 2 years ago, do a podcast for us. We'll get you to edit and produce and film and record and procure the equipment and organize the delivery and make sure that all the information is approved by our marketing team and goes through legal, so that there's so much to do in that process. And I would expect that marketing guy to just want to go to legal, check the content, get it up on the channels, potentially work with the rest of his team to create the show notes and titles and things, and then leave the production stuff to someone else who knows what they're doing. I think there is a justification for return on investment where you get time and you get expertise, and that helps you get to where you want to go faster. But, we're in a very materialistic world that requires literal profit and money return on things. So it doesn't always measure up the way we want it to. And that's seen in the industry too. Like there are very few studios creating podcasts these days for those 5 figures you were talking about. I don't think any of them exist anymore. The Reply Alls, the Spotify produced programs. I think Meghan Markle didn't get her second run at a podcast maybe for that reason. I'm not sure how close you are to the royal families or subsidiary royal family members' media careers.
But yeah, that's the thing. There's so many different types of podcasters, and the value to small podcasters of hiring an editor is huge. And there's all kinds you can find podcast editors in all price ranges. There's being able to hire an editor has never been easier. I remember 5 years ago, it seemed like people would post on Facebook looking for editors, and you'd see probably 50 to 100 people all flood their posts saying, hey, I can edit that. Because back then, it was tougher to find editors. I think a lot of people didn't realize Fiverr and Upwork existed. Unfortunately, for us, those platforms do exist, but it makes things a lot easier for those looking for creative services to find people who can offer those. It puts more of an onus on us as creatives to learn the marketing side of things, so we don't have to rely on those types of platforms. So we can charge more for the value that we're providing our clients and finding those who aren't just shopping on price.
Yeah. Anyway, so get in touch with Tansiasta Creative. New rebrand coming in shortly.
Yeah.
Get your strategy in today.
And I mean, that's one of the things that I've always encouraged podcast editors to do is learn the marketing side of things, because what is the number one question we see clients asking? How do we grow our show? How do we get more listeners? How do we market our show? If we as podcast editors, if we don't understand marketing, if we tell people when they ask, how do you find clients? Well, I get them word of mouth. How is that going to help your clients if you don't know how to market your own services? How can you help them market their show? How can you understand what's entailed in trying to identify an audience and figuring out if the content is actually reaching that audience? So the best thing you can do for yourself and your clients, and this applies to content creators as well as podcast editors. If you're creating something and you want people to see it, understanding at least the basics of marketing goes a long way.
Yeah. And knowing where you're putting it, getting the reps in just to be able to tell what does work and what doesn't. Creating that content yourself. It's something that I tell podcast producers to do sometimes when the question comes up. And you might be a unique case here, Jesse, where I think you've never had a podcast before that you've done yourself. But that creating a podcast is the easiest way to learn podcast marketing sometimes. And then that likewise exposes you to the ways in which you'd procure clients for yourself as an editor, because you're going to be marketing to where podcast producers are if you create a podcasting podcast, for example. It all just carries across. You're absolutely spot on there.
Yeah, and touching on what you said, no, I've never had a podcast. I actually forced myself into the YouTube thing and course creation to learn video editing. And because neither one of us, Tara or me, we didn't have any real experience with YouTube. So a few years ago, I'm like, okay, we need to figure out the content marketing piece. She's a writer, so blogs, we understand. But video, she knows storytelling. She knows how to do video. But YouTube was really kind of a new thing. So I took the opportunity to, okay, let's learn video editing. Let's start a YouTube channel and figure out how this works. It helps us be able to work with clients who, hey, we want to start a YouTube channel. What do we do? If I didn't have that experience, I can do what a lot of people do, go to Google, and we get kind of this really generic kind of chat AI, chat GPT type responses of here's what everybody says to do. And as you start doing this, you realize there's some truth to what you read, but there's a lot of nuances that aren't covered. And just having like a bullet list of you do this, 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 and this, that's not the same thing as really diving in and getting your hands dirty and really seeing how things work, testing stuff to see how important are the titles, how important are the thumbnails. And that's what YouTube comes down to. It's about titles, thumbnails, timeliness, and at least for the type of content I create, having a good feel for what my audience is looking for and creating content that is easily searchable. And I think that's where a lot of podcasters kind of miss the mark. They just want to keep making their audio podcasts the same way they always have, but just add a video element. When you talk about a number of different unrelated topics during one podcast, it makes it hard to write a very search-friendly title that covers all of that. So if you can't write a title that's going to kind of fall in line with what somebody's going to YouTube to search for, you're not going to get nearly as much out of the search algorithm as you might expect.
Yeah. And it's so easy to just armchair philosophize and learn about that stuff and never practice any of it. Like I'm even thinking of putting together a video for myself, or maybe even do a video series alongside a kind of reboot of Coffee with a Podcaster, which is my podcasting podcast, which I'm now flipping to away from small audio only monologues into interviews. And really feel like I need a place to sit down and say things like I want to say there, which is that a lot of the time we have people who consume a lot of content to learn about a thing. They never do the thing, but they feel like they know enough about the topic to be able to tell other people what they should do about that particular thing. And I think a lot of aspects of podcasting and YouTube are both the same in that sense. Like there was a Reddit post I saw recently about a bloke who was debunking the idea that dynamic microphones have better noise rejection than condenser microphones, which I think was a video made in response to that type of thing. And if you understand how microphones work, of course, it makes sense. Julian Krause, I believe, was the person who put that video together. But you really do have to get into it and get a feel for it and understand it. You have to create like you did. I'm the converse case where I've had enough clients who want video at this point that I've had practice on other people's shows on YouTube to kind of get a feel for what works, how to put a thumbnail together and package up the content in a way that makes it more attractive, at least in my small case, for the people that I'm providing services to. But however you get the practice in, you got to put the reps in. That's the only way to get it in. And you said that at the very beginning, like the best way that you learn to do stuff is by practicing it. I think it's the best way to do it for any kind of production stuff. Content creator, podcast producer, whatever you're doing, you just have to do practice. You're never going to be 100% perfect as soon as you begin, because you took that Ed Lawrence course that tells you how to create millions of dollars from, making YouTube videos that get more and more views and engagement. Like you have to do the stuff. You have to do it. It's the only way.
Yeah. And one of the kind of good examples I see online is When people ask, how do I market my podcast? How do I get more growth? Everybody comes in, post clips to social media 3 to 5 times a week. Chances are you're not seeing much return on that investment, because if all you're doing is posting 3 to 5 times a week about your podcast, you're just coming off as spamming your social media feed. People are going to stop paying attention. You need to provide more value than you take. And that's something a lot of people seem to not quite grasp yet. That if all you do is post about your podcast, basically, if you're on social media and you're posting it, you're posting to people who already know you. That's not going to help you grow your audience. You need to reach people that don't know about you. And that's where stuff like TikTok can help. And yeah, there is some kind of valid reasoning to posting in certain places where you have a better algorithm. Like YouTube helps with that. TikTok helps with that. But if you're just posting to Facebook about your podcast, you're not getting much outside reach.
Yeah. And I think there's even more nuance that you could dig into there. Like the first place that my brain went is you're doing 3 to 5 times a week. Okay, great. But why? And where? And is that where your audience is to begin with? Like what you pointed out there was perfect. Post that you've got a new episode out, or that the episode released this week 3 to 5 times across a single feed. Very low value. But if you want them to come back to the socials, why are they coming back to that post? Because you're adding value with whatever was extracted from the podcast, potentially. But if you're doing that on Instagram, but the majority of your audience aren't people on Instagram, then it's going to fall on deaf ears anyway. And it's not going to get regurgitated around. That's one of the reasons that I think YouTube is being considered one of the better places to do shorts content, because a lot of people are on YouTube as a platform, and algorithmically, it tends to be pretty good at narrowing your focus at the people who are going to be interested in the kind of content that you've got. But at the same time, you can't come in 100% guns blazing on socials, knowing exactly where your audience is, exactly what you need to give them, and how to deliver that to them in the way that's going to either drag them to your podcast or be aware of your brand in a way that ensures success for whatever content you're creating. It all just takes practice. Like, do a bit of LinkedIn, do a bit of Facebook, do a bit of Instagram. And if after 3 months of doing the same thing over and over again, you see that Instagram is booming and the other two just fall by the wayside, then naturally doing less effort on the ones that don't apply is going to be much better for you. So that kind of thing, like thinking about your audience, thinking about the specific things you want to get from them with the social posting, there are just so many more questions that you could ask, and most people don't think of them. And I think that's part of the paradox that I love leaning on, that people know what 90% of the audience tells them, and if 90% of that audience has garnered their opinions from 90% of the audience as well, then it's just going to be like a blender of generic kind of content or platitudes that don't really contribute much. Yeah.
Yeah.
So easy to say a lot about these things.
It is. But that's where the strategy really comes into play. If you don't have a strategy to your marketing, you're just throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. The more you can take a structured and measured approach, you can really go, okay, this is who I think my target audience is. This is where I think they're going to be. So you can make a very targeted strategy for let's say Tansy Aster Creative, we're brand and business. So we're going to focus our attentions on LinkedIn because that's where people who work in the business world tend to spend most of their time. We might get in there, start doing stuff, and realize, hey, we're not getting the engagement we're looking for. So we take a step back and look, is it our content? Are we on the wrong platform? But starting with a strategy is the best way. So you know, okay, this is what I'm trying to achieve, who I'm trying to aim everything towards. So it makes it easier to figure out what's working and what isn't. If you're just posting about your podcast 3 times a day on Facebook and you get a bunch of likes, but you're not seeing much engagement or increase in listeners, you don't have much to go on other than posting to social media doesn't work.
But you know who it does work for? That strategy of just posting everywhere and getting 1% of the clicks and going, yay, that worked. Spammers. People sending out fake emails from Nigerian princes looking for you to, send them Bitcoin that you can, or holding you hostage for crude images of observing lewd materials. That kind of strategy works for them, but they're doing it from the wrong perspective. You as
Yes, they are.
podcasters don't want to be the spammers of the internet, trying to get your audience by the people you've tricked by dumping your links onto social media without any effort or thought. At the same time, we know that you don't have a huge amount of time, and that once you've done the podcast, you've done like hours and hours of effort at that point, and it's the last thing you want to think about. But spending a bit of time, having that time be structured, setting milestones to be able to evaluate and assess and analyze how that works for you, it yields a lot more returns and you'll see more value from it.
And I think that's one of the things many podcasters don't really seem to understand. Running a podcast is just like running a business. There's going to be a lot of time you have to invest in it outside of just creating it if you want it to be successful. If I'm running a business and I don't market it, it's probably not going to go anywhere. Same thing with a podcast. And if we think about it, whether it's a small individual or a large corporation, or a podcaster they're trying to achieve something, whether it's building their brand, whether it's thought leadership, whether it's trying to land new clients, just being able to get my thoughts out there. Everybody's trying to accomplish something with your podcast. And to achieve that, nobody wants to create a podcast where they're just talking into their microphone and nobody's listening. At least I don't think people set out with that goal of, I just want to say what I say and I don't care if not a single person listens. I think the people that start out and realize there's more to this than just if you build it, they will come. That's why we see pod fade after 5 episodes. It's a lot of work to create the content. It's even more work to try to market it.
Yeah. And I don't want to hear from people, this is just a hobby. This is just a hobby. It's just, I love chatting with my mates and we talk about the TV shows we watch and we have a great time. And that's it. It's just, we're just having a good time. Because those are also the people who eventually end up on a Buzzsprout forum or, a podcasting support group on some random channel asking the question, how do I monetize my channel? This is starting to get expensive. How do I get sponsors for my show? Why is no one listening to my podcast that I put out there just to chat with my mates about TV shows? Like it's not virtue signaling necessarily. I think people start out with the intention that you mentioned there, that it doesn't matter who listens because we're creating the show for us. But invariably, someone looks at that number and when it says 0 or it says 2 downloads after a month, there's something at the back of your mind that goes, why am I doing this? I need more people to listen to my opinions. maybe that's what I need. Yeah. But how do I get them? And the intention kind of gets missed at the beginning of the process. And I think there's a lot of stuff that people kind of pick up on as they go and they look for the quick hacks. Like SEO is one of them. Create podcast titles and show notes, optimize them for SEO. Most people don't actually know what that means in the sense of how it applies to creating a broad impact for the show or where it even goes. They just know that SEO is the answer to discoverability on podcast platforms. But in what aspect? Like, how do you A/B test SEO throughput? How do you test that engagement? What are the words? What are the keywords? Where are you getting them? It's always a more involved process than people give it credit for.
Yeah, if it's a hobby, you shouldn't care about the numbers. You're doing it for the fun. As soon as you start asking, how do I get more listeners? How do I monetize? Now you're approaching it with the goal other than just having fun with it. But
Yeah.
I do want to take a second and ask that if you're enjoying this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with anybody who you might think can benefit from what we're talking about, because we're here to try and help people. So sharing what we're talking about helps us do that. And if you're watching the replay and you've got a question and can't watch one of our streams, you can always submit your questions on the website at tansiasteracademy.com/ask-a-question. So Tansiaster Academy /ask a question with dashes in between each word. So
Awesome.
let's get to these questions we've been trying to answer. We wanted to answer last week, and we were going to answer this week before we run out of time.
Yeah,
And
we
for
get
anybody
all steamed
watching,
up, don't we? Yeah.
for anybody watching, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the comments, and we'll try to get to it as we go through everything. So let's move on to our questions. Question number 1. My editing client sent me 2 movie files via Google Drive for an episode they want to go on YouTube. How would you handle a situation like this? Setting a hard drive isn't an option, and downloading 700 gigabytes of video is going to take forever. I'm not even sure my computer can handle this. My first thought on this is, it sounds like you're not ready to be offering video editing services. And hit the wrong button. Realized you were gone there, Matthew.
It's perfectly fine. I was staying quiet. I was just enjoying the question. Fire away.
But my thoughts are, you're not quite ready to be offering this. If you don't have a plan for downloading large files, if you're not sure your computer can handle those types of files, how are you ready to offer video editing?
It is a big, I don't want to call it a problem, but a lot of the time people don't think of the overall tech required to support large scale stuff. And part of the reason that tricks people is that recording things from Zoom, highly compressed 720p quality video, one of those video files might be like 100 megabytes or something. Then as a podcast producer, you start saying to yourself, 4K video, that's where it's at. And you have to realize that a 720p video, 4 times that size for a 1080p, and then 4 times that size again for 4K. And then whatever length that video is going to be will be the storage that you need to be able to support multiple times across an entire month. That could be terabytes of storage on a computer, not to mention the graphically intensive resources you will need for a video editing platform just to enable you to edit it. Like DaVinci Resolve, for example, has a function inside it that will analyze the video you've got if your computer can't handle the processing power just to look at the footage, preview it while you edit it, and create like a proxy for it. so that you don't have to deal with the native raw footage. You can just cope with it in like a smaller, uh, more digestible format for the resources you have. But oftentimes with video editing platforms, there isn't that opportunity. Like you don't have the time to do that kind of thing. And the questions asked on the forums often lead to problems like this. Like, what computer do I need to support this kind of stuff? Completely ignoring the capacity of your storage. The ability to process video like this at this scale, it requires a lot, a big investment of money, as well as an understanding that the computer you have will be able to support that kind of manipulation. That's where my brain goes. And I've got a tech background. I've been building computers since I was in my teens, 37 now, 6. One of those, mid 30s, mid to late 30s. Um, and my brain goes there. Like we have to keep this stuff in mind. Like you got to check this stuff before you start offering those kinds of services. I think, like you said, like it might sound a bit uncharitable, but you have to be ready. Like you got to be ready to go, even if it's just running off to, I don't know what you have in America, Best Buy, to pick up like a 3 terabyte hard drive USB-C. So for that quick transfer rate, or getting in touch with Comcast or whatever other US provider, Sonic. I don't think Google is doing their Google Fiber anymore, but being able to increase your capacity for internet bandwidth to do the download momentarily, and it all comes at a cost. Sorry, I'm rambling here because this is like, there's so much you have to consider with this kind of thing. But
Well, and
yeah,
the other thing that comes to mind is it sounds like a better job needs to be done during the discovery phase when working with a client. It shouldn't be a surprise that they're going to send you 700 gigabytes of video files. You should already know how they're shooting their video. Are they shooting it on cameras? Are they using Riverside? Are they using Zoom? If they're shooting cameras, are they doing 4K? I know I've seen people say, well, 4K is overkill for YouTube. Not really. You might not want to render in 4K, but having raw files in 4K gives you future proofness for archiving it. You've got the highest quality possible at this point in time. And editing, you can zoom in without loss of quality. So shooting 1080, you're already starting with a little bit less than you could be. And yeah, it makes it a little easier on the technology, but for long-term use, we can't think about just right now, what YouTube is capable of right now. Let's think about 5-10 years from now, when internet is inevitably going to be faster, disk space is going to be even cheaper. Having those files in 4K is going to be very useful. It's kind of like if record companies stopped, instead of storing everything on master tapes, just kept the CDs and the records for archiving.
Yeah, that would be the
You wouldn't
worst.
be able to go through and remaster for new platforms as they come up. You wouldn't be able to go back and remaster using newer technology to do whatever they're trying to achieve. Taking something like Dark Side of the Moon and turning it into an Atmos mix wouldn't be possible if you didn't have the master recordings.
Yeah, even thinking of film, like just because a lot of film projectors in movie cinemas are digital based projectors now, it doesn't mean they're just getting the ultraviolet Blu-ray ripped version when they do that 10th anniversary of Interstellar or whatever it is back at the cinema again. They upres that content from the original film that it was filmed on. Not always in every case, obviously, but like the big budget stuff, that will often have a uh, regular film equivalent with which to create an upresed version on. So having that 4K is always better than the 1080p alone. But the other thing that I see all the time and will become more and more prescient as time goes on is I exported my podcast and the quality looks awful. It looks fine in the video editor, but when I export it, the quality looks all weird. How do I make the export better? And then you fall down the rabbit hole that I have so far of trying to optimize the compression codec, trying to choose the right file type for certain types of webcam recording elements, like however you get the footage should impact the delivery mechanism you use to generate the content, and then what kind of content does YouTube take. It doesn't just have to be H.264 or H.265. You can export it MPX OP1A or someone will correct me on that. I haven't fully investigated myself, obviously, but you can generate entire lossless file formats that can exceed like 20 gigabytes for a half-hour video if it's got enough elements in there. Upload that to YouTube and it's fine. And you encounter the same problem that this person has. You're working with massive file formats just to retain that quality that you expect from Diary of a CEO or Modern Wisdom or something like that. And just to measure up to them, you kind of hit a brick wall because the technology doesn't support it. So having the stuff available to you is great, especially when you want to do that remaster and you learn how to better export stuff. But the other problem that comes to my mind is that discovery call is super important because you need to know what kind of recording devices they're using too. Because color grading, I don't think is a thing that people think about in video editing for podcasting quite a lot. It's something that I've only just started dabbling in myself, and I'm, practicing more so than researching how best to do it, if only because it's pretty low tier stuff in terms of recordings generally when people send you virtual recordings. But if it's in studio stuff, like you've got a couple of Sony Alpha 7s or something, 7Xs, I don't know. I'm not a camera guy yet, but I'll be learning. But learning how to put a LUT on that content to make it look great. Color grading the content in a way that kind of accentuates the stuff. Let's say that you've got someone who recorded themselves and there was a big bright light spot right in the middle of their forehead and they've got a shaved head. How do you tone that down and make it, less apparent? The available file quality in that bigger file format is going to be better graded in a video editor than it is in like a 720p Zoom version of whatever that is. In which case, not only do you need the color grading skill, but you also need the capacity that this guy's looking for to manage those big files, because so much great available quality becomes possible when you deal with these file formats in the size that they are. But you just have to be ready for it. There's no other way to say that.
No, there isn't. So let's move on to the next question. So how much editing do you do of your guests? I've seen responses from editing removes authenticity to editing makes for a better listening experience. How much editing should a podcaster do? Do we pull out the ums and ahs? Do we cut out the spaces? And this isn't the easiest thing to answer, but one, editing absolutely does not remove authenticity. Just about every form of media we consume is edited to some degree. The only exception might be stuff that's live, but even that has so much pre-production, scripting, teleprompters, you name it, that there's not a whole lot of editing needed because everything's ready for them. I mean, even going to stuff like concerts, everything is so choreographed these days to everybody's playing to clicks so that everything syncs up to video screens. Some bands now have stuff set up where the sounds they use automatically change throughout a song, so they don't have the flexibility to just kind of extend a section if they needed to, because everything is tied to a grid. And that's why it was so nice. I don't know how I got onto music, but it does kind of tie in. It was nice seeing a band last year that was just a 3-piece rock band, no video screens, no click tracks, no production, just 3 guys playing together. And I'll find a way to bring this back to the editing. And it's just, editing doesn't remove authenticity. What people hear is bad editing, like you commented at the beginning of the stream. A good editor is invisible. So if you hear that it's been edited, that's where you start getting these comments that it removes authenticity, because you know it's been edited. But as far as go on.
I was just going to jump into my usual ramble about how editing is always a spectrum. Like, I think people try to discuss editing as if it should happen or it shouldn't. But there are so many aspects. Like, already in this question, we've got 3 different ones. Like, do you remove weird intermediary content that adds no value? Do you remove silence? Do you, or how much of that do you do? Those are just 3 components of what could be the remainder of what editing involves. Like, for me, the first thing I go to is audio improvement. It is incredibly rare that someone is recording a podcast in an environment that's perfectly ideal. Like us, we've got some very good gear rolling here, but not everybody's in that position. So the first thing that every person should be doing in post-production is figuring out how to roll off the bottom 60 hertz of their EQ. They should be using noise reduction on the voice. They should be removing background noise. They should be doing some of these things that can be relatively light lifts, depending on how much you know, or how much money you have available to spend on the tools to do that. But that's just the cleanup. Like, the editing could be the sequencing of segments. It could be putting an intro and an outro at the top and bottom. It could be layering music underneath. Like, I think there's a very rare case where there's no editing involved. And anyone who doesn't do it, like you say, it becomes very apparent, because if there's no editing or bad editing, that's when you know it's not happening. But for the listener, I don't think they're hearing that and going, oh yeah, this guy's got the most authentic podcast I've ever heard. When he took a drink, we could hear him swallowing it and the water going down his throat as he was in between sentences. This is the most authentic I'm ever going to get. At most, the listener will ignore that, and they won't worry about it, because there's a lot that the listener ignores, and that could be a subject for an entire future stream if we were going to start talking about that stuff. But yeah, it's a spectrum. Like, you figure out what you can do to make your podcast sound the best it needs to sound. You might be leaving ums and ahs in there, but you could have highly audio improved, cleaned up, repaired voices on that show that includes those great ums and ahs. It's always a spectrum. There's always a bunch of boxes to tick or untick, I think. Anyway.
I agree. And for me, I look at it always from the listening experience, because we might be creating the content, but like we talked about, generally we want other people to enjoy the content we're creating. So from my perspective, we need to provide the listeners with the best experience possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean cutting out all of the ums and uhs. That doesn't necessarily mean cutting out all of the spaces. And it also doesn't mean, I see this all the time, we'll leave some of the ums in because it makes it sound more real. If you notice, I don't does that mean that anything I do is not real because I don't Do I have some editor in the background editing out all of my ums as we are doing this live?
No.
So
but you've got the best editor. You've got the best editor, the one who does it before you need to do it. That's a good argument for that pre-production section that you said before. Yeah.
And it really comes down to, as editors, our job is to make the audio sound good and to remove the types of distractions that are going to cause our listeners to stop listening. So that's how I approach things when I edit. I mean, my clients will tell me the types of things they want edited out. Some want as many of the ums and ahs taken out. Others want it to sound more natural and conversational. There's no right or wrong. Like you said, there's a spectrum there. But for this other stuff, I'm listening for the types of distractions that are going to make somebody more likely to stop listening. A mispronounced word is not going to be that. A pause while somebody is trying to think of an answer is not going to do that. If I get up and go answer the door because I have a package and then come back, yeah, we should cut that 5 minutes of silence out. But other than that, you need to do what's going to work best for you. And I'll kind of leave it there. Do you have any wrap up on this question?
No, nothing specific. I think that's a great way to direct people's attention when things like this come up. Think about your listener. Think about your audience. That's the best way to decide the best is.
And we are now at 10 o'clock. How are you doing on time?
We can go a little bit longer if you like.
Okay. So how do you avoid undercharging when working with budget-conscious clients? I'll let you take first stab at this.
Well, first, fight that imposter syndrome that tells you to pull out chunks and evaluate small pieces of your offering by the potential client that you're pitching the price to, and the different aspects of what you're providing a service for, the type of podcast they have, the circumstances they're in, the socioeconomic climate, your ability to deliver the content well for them, your ability to edit. Like, these are all the questions that float through your mind every time a client comes to you and says, so how much is it per episode? And in reality, I think you, Jesse, have actually got the best approach to begin, even if it's not the place where you end. But to avoid the undercharging, I think creating the baseline that you have usually recommended, at least in the content I've seen you in, is the best way to start not undercharging people. And that is that you figure out what your baseline is. Like, what are your costs every month to have the technology that you use, the apps and plugins that you use? What is that monthly cost? And then where do you live? What is your rent? What are your costs of living? If this is the only thing that you do, having the budget and understanding how much you need to make per month to be able to live, and then structure in what you need to make a profit, balance the numbers and then figure out what your ideal cost is. And then if you need to, work backwards from there, but start at a point at which you're not going to be losing money. And I think having that frame, at least from the beginning, even if you hate it and you never follow it, which you probably should, but even if you never follow it, you need somewhere to start. You need a baseline price to work with that means that you're not going to be losing money every time you do an edit for a client. And like, we've all been there. I've been there. I've been the person who's done $50 to $100 per edit because someone has a very low budget and I desperately needed a client. But you have to figure out what your costs are. Like, just because you're getting paid doesn't mean that you're earning money. I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, what I'd say is you're not going, unless you are a very budget provider, you're not going to be able to work with everybody. Kind of what Matthew was saying. And I learned this from Christo of the Future. It's called the MVE, or MLE, Minimum Level of Engagement. You have to do some math to get there, but you need to have this baseline price where it's not worth it for me to take a gig if it pays less than this much. So that makes it easier to go into any kind of call with a prospect knowing no matter what, I cannot charge less than this. And when it comes to inevitably clients or prospects trying to negotiate on stuff, if they want a lower price than what you're providing, ask them what services can, or yeah, I guess just services can I reduce. Don't try to negotiate the same scope of work for less price. If they want a lower price, they might be able to get it, but you're going to do less work for them. Do you want to forego show notes if that's something you had in your package? Or maybe you're going to do less editing. Maybe they wanted all of the ums cut out that you could. Maybe we're going to spend less time on that to hit their price point. Work with them, but make it clear what things you can remove to hit that price point.
Yeah. And starting with the boat complete, like, hey, this is what you're buying, and then negotiate by pulling things off the boat, until they end up with a dinghy. But then you're working backwards from a price point instead of what some people do, which is working forwards by asking them what they want and then building a price based on what they want. In both of those cases, whether you're building down by deconstructing or up by adding, in both cases, you're going to find out what the budget is and where you hit their limit. But if you're taking things away, that's you removing work that you do. Whereas the other side, you're adding more things to do and you'll hit that price point before you stop adding things. Invariably. It always happens. You always need to do more.
And by doing it that way, you also get them to realize what's important to them. They're trying to get the better deal. They're trying to get the same scope of work for less. So when you start saying, well, to hit that price point, I have to do less editing. I'm not going to be able to take out the ums and uhs. They'll go, oh, but I really need that. Okay, this is how much it's going to cost if you want that. A lot of times, you're basically calling them on their bluff. Okay, you want lower prices? This is how we do it. Well, but I want all of this that you proposed. Well, then you're going to have to pay this price. And if they're unwilling to, you have to be okay just walking away. You're not going to work with every client, every prospect. Even if it's an existing client, at some point, they're going to part ways with you, or you're going to part ways with them. No business relationship is forever.
Yeah. And that scarcity mindset is really, I think it's a huge problem in podcast editing, at least. Content editing generally, I think there's always more content editors for YouTube or whatever. I don't even want to try and explore what that market's like. But for podcast editing particularly, you always worry about losing clients. You feel like, I think a lot of the time, we presume that the value that we drive and our success is based on us having clients at whatever risk that is to what we're doing. We just need to have someone to edit for. But if I've learned anything over the last year and a half of podcast editing, it's that you can have as many clients as makes you feel good and successful, but more often than not, if you're offering them all the same at really wildly varying price points, you cannot scale your effort to match that client value unless you start shopping it out and subcontracting to other editors. Generally, unless you can improve the way you edit significantly, like cut down your time by 50% simply by working harder or working faster or taking shortcuts, you cannot scale that time. So not being afraid to walk away from a no or feeling like you're the worst editor in the world because someone doesn't get in touch with you. Like, I've had a client drop off my radar completely because they never came back. I told them their podcast sounded great. Like, you barely need me. Uh, Come back with another recording. We'll see what we can improve. Crickets. I've had
Yeah.
people, other editors, refer people on to me have a meeting with them. We organize a price. We decide what we're going to do. And I never get anything. And then they contact that editor who referred me to them again for the content instead. And I get referred back, and then nothing happens because sometimes they just don't want to work with you, but sometimes you also shouldn't work with them. Like, don't avoid the red flags. One of them being price. If they can't pay the price, it's okay to walk away. Sometimes you just need to be told that, but it's okay.
Exactly. And I think part of that scarcity mindset comes back to what we were talking about not understanding how to market your own services. And we could go on to that for quite a while, but let's move on to the next question.
Sure.
Which is partially obscured. So, should I recommend a client not to release an episode? A client sent 3 hours of raw audio when they usually send me an hour and a half. One of the two guests rambles, making for an edit that is too choppy, and their answers to questions are convoluted and difficult to follow and boring. Additionally, the guest's audio quality isn't good, and there's an audible baby throughout most of the recording. I worry that it may damage my client's podcast to release it. It's a new podcast, and I don't think it makes for a good listening experience. Should I recommend the client not release this episode? I have a good relationship with the client, and I don't think they would be upset by the suggestion. How do you handle this situation? And to me, again, it comes back to, if they're setting you double what you're expecting, what's in your agreement? There should be both sides should be under the same expectations of what is provided to you, what your services cover. As far as this episode in question, a lot of this sounds like this is more kind of on the performance end of things. If we can't change the questions are convoluted and difficult to follow and or boring. To me, it's not my job to decide what's boring and what's not. That's more of a content editor. And I know some podcast editors do content editing along with, I don't know, like distraction removal. That's more what I do. But yeah, there's definitely a place to make a recommendation to the client. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say recommend not to release the episode, but give them context saying, these are the concerns I have, and this is how it may impact your new show, and let the client make the determination.
And the big question there too, I mean, like, we got to put the podcast editor hat on like you did there. That, let's say that this person has edited the 3 hours of audio down to an hour to, get at what they need. The reason they have this information, that it's boring, that the questions are rambly, like it's a lot of waffling going on, kind of like what I do. And they've got that completed edit in front of them. What happens when you bring it up to the client and say, I don't think this is up to standard, buddy. I think we gotta get rid of this thing. I don't think you should release it. You got to think, okay, well, I've told this person that the work I've done has not been valuable enough to salvage the episode being release worthy. Are they still going to pay me? Like, you're going to them and saying, you shouldn't release this. That'll be whatever my fee is, please. Or have you reviewed the content before editing? I'd be very interested to see how many podcast editors actually listen to or watch all of the content they have before they jump into the edit. Generally, I just jump right in and get things going. So that would be the first thing that comes to my mind. But I think you're spot on. I think really it depends on the relationship you have. Like this is where we're different, you and me, Jesse, where I tend to be more involved in the production with the clients I have and contribute meaningfully to their strategy and what they go through in terms of creating the content and recording it and things like that. Like I like to get into the actual content side of things a little bit. But even me, I don't think it just depends on the relationship. I don't think any episode is unworthy of releasing, but it's not up to us as editors to make that decision. I think if we're an editor and we're just editing the content and the relationship that I've just described isn't there, then I think you just edit the episode, do the best you can, and see what they say. That's the best way to make sure that you get paid for the work that you put in, unless they come in first with the caveat that they thought it was a little bit bad and that maybe, maybe it's not worth editing. What do you think? Then as the editor, you can give it a quick pass and say, oh, yeah, that 3 hours isn't what we had in our agreement. It's going to cost you a little bit more to edit this guy, in which case they might be like, oh, yeah, well, we can't release that then. Yeah, it's an unusual one. I think everyone would approach it a little bit differently. But from just a purely editing perspective, no, I don't have anything rigid. I think it's got to be, it depends.
And more than anything, I think there's a teaching opportunity here with this editor to their client. And that's setting expectations of when you record an interview, you're the recording engineer, you're the producer. If you hear they have their kid in the space and it's crying throughout the show, the first time you hear it, just pause things and ask, hey, is this a good time for us to be recording this? Could we reschedule this for a time when you can have a babysitter who can watch the kid while we do the interview? Because my listeners are not going to enjoy listening to this throughout an entire episode.
But let's respect the editor too. Like, there's a lot of stuff you can do in post-production. I haven't seen Isotope's RX baby remover come out recently. I don't think it would be easy for the editor trying to do it.
No, and this is where it is really important to have a conversation when you onboard a client about what's possible, what's not, and why it's always most important to get the best recordings we can and not rely on the editor to fix everything during editing. Because we can fix some things. We can perform small miracles sometimes, but we can't fix everything. We just can't.
Yeah. We are more alchemists than magicians. That's how I'd describe it anyway.
Pretty much, yeah. And one last one. This came out a couple of weeks ago, and I've seen it kind of floating around the internet in various groups. This is the 2025 rate guide from Air Media, which they try to... These are kind of the standard rates for professionals in these spaces. But I saw this posted in a couple of groups kind of around the context of here's what professionals are charging. But when it comes to podcast editing, unless you are working for a large agency who offers high value or high cost packages, you're not going to see these types of rates. Maybe for mixing, you might see the very low end of this, but for podcast editor, you'd have to be charging what, $225 for an episode to do a 60-minute interview style show to hit $75 an hour. You'd have to do that in 3 hours. Let's say you can do the edit in 3 hours. There's still the render time. You've got client communications. You've got all sorts of other unpaid tasks, invoicing. So you're still not even seeing that $75 an hour. And
Yeah.
with Fiverr and Upwork, these are the prices for like studio type industries. So like if you go into a music studio, you're going to pay a mixer or an engineer $75 to $200 an hour. If you go on Upwork, you're going to see most people are charging significantly less than this. And like if you're a researcher and you're doing this as a freelancer, 1099, whatever, self-employment, $30 an hour is not much when you factor in that probably a quarter to a third of that has to go to taxes. So take stuff like this with a grain of salt. Don't look at this and say, hey, I can be charging $200 an hour to edit podcasts. Yeah, you can charge that. It's going to be a challenge to find clients willing to pay that. And that's what we need to understand. We can charge whatever we want. The more we charge, the harder it is to find clients who are willing to pay that much.
But at the same time, guides like this are useful. Like what we talked about earlier, where I described your methodology with setting up the pricing for yourself. You should definitely understand all of that, like your cost of living, the cost of upkeep, maintenance of the products you use, all that stuff. Build that into your pricing point. But having this is a very useful kind of measure for yourself, mostly because it's union based. Like there's going to be an evaluation of the rates here that has gone on in the background. They've surveyed people, they've looked at companies, they've appreciated value from people who are part of unions or part of the organization and sought to generate these fee options based on job, based on what people would be doing. The context of this, of AIR particularly, is beyond podcasting, though. Like there's obviously a lot of jobs that it covers here. The reason I mention this is because in Australia, I've recently become aware of a union type thing for freelancers that has a rate card as well. And this is specifically for podcast oriented freelancers who are looking to charge. Now it's a little bit cheaper than this, I think, with the Australian dollar being the way that it is. But it's a good way for you to take a measure of what you're charging and see how it compares to the rest of the market. But as you say, like you can't come into the industry and saying, well, I'll just charge $200 an hour. So that'll be like, $3,000 an episode, please. Probably not going to happen. There's a lot more stuff that goes underneath or on top of that. Like how long have you been doing this? How fast is your delivery? What is your quality of delivery by comparison to people who would be charging a little bit more? Even completely ignoring where the money could potentially come from. You start pricing people out. You may end up with no clients, and scarcity mindset is terrible. But, if you're not charging anybody for your services, your upkeep becomes 100% of what you're paying, and it's just digging out of your savings. So you kind of have to, approach things with a bit of a measure of realism, practicality. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing is we need to figure out how much I need to charge, how much you need to charge, because that's the price that matters. We see these big numbers and think, oh, I could be charging this. Just because you can doesn't mean you need to. You're going to be in a better situation if you can charge less, because then you're more competitive on the price. It's like any kind of product out there. You can buy the premium product, but fewer people buy the premium one when you can buy the mid-tier one. It depends on what you're looking for. And yeah, in my situation, Tara and I are completely self-employed. We live in Washington, which is not a cheap area of the US to live in. We have to pay for our health insurance out of pocket. We have to pay for our mortgage out of pocket. If, say, I was working a full-time job and Tara was working in self-employment, she could get away with charging less because all of a sudden my job is paying for the bills. It's covering health insurance. So that reduces our overhead. So for a lot of content, for a lot of podcast editors, freelancer types who have a significant other or a full-time job, trying to aim for these types of prices is going to be a huge disservice to you because you don't have the same overhead that the people who are offering these services as their only means of income are.
And this is the problem that I have with a lot of surveys that get done by people who are well-intentioned and well-meaning, trying to create a standard across a collective group of people. They tend not to account for enough or as much data as they should to be able to make those inferences. Like if you have a pool of people charging $100 to $150 per episode and one person who charges $1,200 per episode, that's going to skew the average, and then you need more data to be able to justify why that one person can charge $1,200 an episode and the rest of these people charge $100, and you don't have that data with you or you don't present it, it becomes almost impossible for someone to use it as a standard. So I'm sure these guys do have the ability to justify these prices somehow, but just because you're in a group of people that submits a survey every year and collects data and tells you stuff, you still have to do that inward looking. Like, just because this group can charge $30 an hour doesn't mean you should if you can't live on it. Like, that has to be the primary thing. You have to be sustainable. You have to be able to work and live and eat and breathe, all the things.
Exactly. And the other thing something like this doesn't really take into consideration is this is aimed at a US group. When it comes to basically any type of creative service, it's not a US-based thing. We're competing worldwide these days. So when anything becomes commoditized like podcast editing has, people can shop on price. So the more competitive we are on price, the easier time we have. And that's why I'm moving away from strictly offering podcast editing as one of our core services, because we have higher cost of living. It's harder and harder each year to find business clients who can afford to pay the rates we need to charge to remain sustainable. But that's my personal situation. That's not going to apply to a lot of people out there, because you're doing this as a side hustle. You're doing this and you have a significant other who brings in a stable income. That frees you up to a lot more flexibility than I have.
That's it. Look inward and outward and take a measure. That's the way to
I
do
like
it.
that. That's a good way to close. I want to thank everybody for watching. Matt, I'd like to thank you for taking the time and giving me an extra 30 minutes for everybody to finish up these questions. But yeah, thanks. I don't know why I froze up there, but thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you next week.
Absolutely. See you guys next time.
Bye. Yeah, I think... Okay.